So we're going to be looking at some skulls today. What I have here first off is a sheep skull. This was actually prepared by some of my vertebrate anatomy students for the lab. So I keep on telling you that you just give me any skull and I could tell you what that animal ate, right? Because the dentition and the shape of the skull can give you a lot of clues as to what an animal eats. So let's talk about what we could deduce about the different systems that are associated with the skull. The first thing that always amazes me when I look at the skull of a bovine or any sort of herd animal is how huge the space is where the nasal cavity would be. Let me show you head on. All right, so this would be a space for an enormous nasal apparatus because these animals, they sense their environment. They're very, very scent oriented, right? They can pick up on signals from each other. They could pick up on pheromones. They could pick up on predators, right? They could pick up on where food is just by sensing the environment via scent. They also have these large, almost laterally placed eyes to give them a wide field of view. So while they're grazing, they can keep an eye out for predators. But most of what you can deduce regarding diet comes from the shape of the jaw and the teeth. So look at how the jaw of this skull of the sheep is square, right? This has to do with the large block of chewing muscles that are supported by this sheep's jaw. Right? So while it's grinding its food, it has this huge block of cheek muscle that's going to help it to grind its food. So the joint where the lower jaw meets the upper jaw, it's a fairly round area that allows for a round and round articulation of jaw, lower jaw to upper jaw. So this allows for the chewing motion of the cud. So the shape of the jaw to support a massive block of chewing muscles, the hinge of the jaw, lower jaw to the upper jaw, right, which is going to allow for round and round cud-like chewing. Those are some hints as to the diet as well. Now, our major hint, however, is in the actual dentition. So you remember what our teeth are. We have our incisors up front. Then we would normally have incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. In a herbivore, like a sheep, you do not have upper incisors. So the upper part of this sheep, there are no teeth on the upper jaw. It's a fleshy, a rough, a tough, fleshy pad that acts like a chopping board. So the lower incisors are chopping against this fleshy part of the upper jaw here, right, to cut the blades of grass. And they're just using this like a little lawnmower going through and grazing on the grass, right? So it's not that we have a whole series of no-teeth sheep. Sheep basically don't have upper incisors. They do have their lower incisors though. And if you were to touch this, it's actually very, very sharp. These are some sharp teeth, right? You could get a nasty bite from this. Okay, so that's one characteristic of the bovines, the bovids, the cows, and the sheep. Cows, sheep, goats, deers, right? They all have the ruminants, those that have the four-chambered stomachs, right? They don't have this upper incisor. They don't have the upper incisors. They have the lower incisors. They have this flat, fleshy upper mouth, part of the fleshy pad in their upper mouth that acts as a cutting board. The next major characteristic of these herbivores is this space here. So where you would normally have the canines in our skulls, those canines are absent, And the space where the canines were are elongated into this space here that's called the diastema. This diastema allows the massive tongue of this ruminant to move around and around as this animal chews. So this is a space to allow for the manipulation of food. Then when we look at the premolars and molars, let's look at the lower jaw. The premolars and molars are fairly regular in shape, and they are very, very, very sharp, right? Now these teeth have what is known as open roots, so they continually grow. They keep on growing throughout the lifespan of the sheep, and they are always being ground down, because what this animal does, it acts as a grinding surface for the food to be broken down mechanically, right? So it's a very, very sharp surface caused by ridges on these premolars and molars, right? If you look at the upper jaw, you see that they also have these very, very sharp ridges. Okay, so that is some deductions that we can make about the skull, about the diet of a sheep from the skull of the sheep. Okay, so I'm moving this aside, and then I'm going to bring the skull of I'll give you 2 seconds to guess what this is. 1001, 1002, it's a pig, right? So we have a pig skull here, and we're going to look at the dentition of this pig. All right. So again, you're seeing a massive lower jaw, because this animal is using its mouth as a weapon. It's using its mouth as a tool. So you and I, we can, if we have a big piece of food that we need to break down into smaller pieces, like a really big roti, we can use our hands, we could use some tools, we could use a knife and a fork. Although if you use a knife and a fork to eat roti, I'm officially disowning you, right? An animal that does not have forepaws needs to use its mouth to manipulate food. So this pig here has this massive jaw that's going to work the massive, or act as a point of attachment for massive jaw muscles that are going to help it to break down the food. Again, if we look at it head on, you see that there's a very huge nasal space for the nasal apparatus, and pigs, as you know, have very, very sensitive nasal system for detecting scents, right? You've probably heard stories about pigs being used to find truffles, right? Truffles, not the kind of truffles you buy in the candy store, the very expensive truffles that you get in fine restaurants. They are mushrooms. They're very rare. They're difficult to find. You have to be trained to find them, and they're extremely expensive, and they actually train pigs to find the truffles. Okay, so you're seeing incisors. These incisors are long, right? Again, because pigs are omnivores, right? Unlike the sheep that we just saw, which is a herbivore, this pig is an omnivore. It uses its teeth to break into dead and decaying material to find insects and to eat basically anything it can get its claws on. So it has these large, sharp incisors. The canines are not as developed as you would see in a carnivore, but it still has canines. Some pigs actually have tusks that help them to root through dead and decaying material, like overturn logs to see what's under. If you look at Lion King, you might see Pumbaa has these large tusks that it uses to overturn rocks. And when you look at the molars and the premolars now, right, so the jaw is hinged shut here. I can't get it open. But the molars and the premolars look a little stronger, a little sturdy, they look fairly different from each other, and they're ridged. So these do not grow with the pig. They're not open rooted, so they're not going to continuously grow as we saw with the herbivore, but they can break down a wide variety of food material, right? They can actually share flesh, cut flesh. So pigs can actually eat meat. They will eat meat. In fact, okay, so if you're into serial killers, I can't remember the serial killer's name, but there was a very famous serial killer who actually disposed of his victims by cutting up their bodies and throwing them in for the pigs to eat. And this is a factoid that I know. I do not know why I know it and why I feel the need to bring it up to you when I'm talking about dentition, but it's just to illustrate the point that pigs do eat meat. So they need to have some sharp surfaces for shearing and cutting meat, right? And they need to have these big teeth for crushing a variety of substances. So the dentition of a pig is the dentition of an omnivore similar to us, where you have variation in teeth form from the incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. You have the crushing force being brought about by this large jaw, and you also have the teeth being adapted for both crushing vegetative material and also for shearing and slicing through meat. So finally, we're going to look at the dentition of a carnivore. So this is again courtesy my vertebrate anatomy class, the Bio 378 class, where one of the projects for that class is to basically find and process a skull or a skeleton for their labs as part of their practical marks. And they found a dog that sadly was run over. It was a very large dog. From the fur that was around the semi-decayed carcass that they found, it was a German Shepherd. So she was a very large girl. So sad, breaks my heart because I love puppies. Probably ran away during a firework episode and got run over, and later my students found her and preserved her skeleton for us. So we're going to use her to tell us about the digestive system, about the jaws, the dentition of a carnivore. Okay, so carnivores have a very large nasal apparatus as well because they detect their prey with smell. They have very large eye sockets to contain large eyes because they use a lot of visual cues as well. And one thing to note, compared to our omnivore and our herbivore, the shape of the jaw is more rounded. It doesn't have this big square jaw. It has a more rounded jaw. The articulation of the jaw to the lower jaw to the upper jaw also does not allow for the round and round mastication movement. It allows for an up and down chomping movement. And if you ever look at a dog or a cat eat, they don't chew the same way we do to chew round and around. They basically chomp, 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 chomp. Now, another key characteristic that will immediately tell you that this is a carnivore would be these large canines, right? These massive canines. So these canines are used to rip through flesh, sometimes to kill the prey. Lions, for example, use their canines to hamstring their prey, which is basically to cut the tendon that connects their thigh muscle to their lower limbs, right? So these are some very sharp teeth for ripping and cutting through flesh. And then you have your incisors, which are fairly sharp as well, right? So your incisors, canines, then your premolars, so we have some teeth missing here, sadly. You have your premolars and then your molars. Now, as with carnivores, the lower premolar, the upper premolar and the lower molars are adapted into a special type of tooth or special type of teeth called the carnassials, right? So these carnassials are these huge teeth that are going to cut a gnaw through bone, right? So if you ever give your puppy something to eat that's a little difficult to chew on, you see that they're going to turn to their side and chew like chomp 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 on the side like that, right? So like our puppy at home, we always give her water bottles to play with, and she's going to play with them until she actually gets the cap and the label and everything off. And what she does, she actually turns to her side to gnaw that bottle cap off with her carnassials, right? Those carnassials are specific to carnivores to help to break through tough tissue like bones, right? So the skull of a carnivore is usually very, very distinctive compared to an omnivore or or herbivore, mainly because of this large canine and the carnassials.